This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. This special episode of the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast is produced in partnership with Amaretti, and as such, we are going to talk about flavor. From the very earliest days of what we now know as craft beer, flavor has been a defining factor and a guiding mantra of sorts for brewers casting themselves against the monolith of light macro lager that dominated American brewings for so many decades. If you track it back, fruits and spices have been ingredients in beer for as long as beer has been made. So this modern era of craft brewing is more rediscovery than revolution, but there is no denying that familiar and enticing or even exotic and intriguing flavors have been an incredible draw in bringing people into the fold who might never have considered themselves beer drinkers. Of course, the ways that we can now add those fruit and spice flavors to beer have evolved significantly from the earliest days of craft brewing. And just as brewers dose thiol precursors and flowable hop products into their beers to get the hop flavors they want without the ones they don't, brewers now have tools to target and dial in fruit and spice notes with incredible precision, and this precision is increasingly important as brewers explore low ABV and non-alcoholic beers and beverages. If you put an ingredient on the label, your customers expect to sense it in the aroma and flavor of the beer or beverage that you make. Over the course of this next hour, we're going to explore best practices for delivering flavor impact that's noticeable, authentic, seamless, and artful, but that also works to support the bottom line for breweries facing ever-increasing input costs. Joining me for this conversation are Michael Lally, brewmaster at Krebs Brewing and Prairie Artisan Ales. Welcome to the podcast, Michael.
Thank you.
Also, Micah Rush, R&D manager at the brewery and Offshoot Beer out in Placentia, California. Welcome to the podcast, Micah.
Thanks for having me.
And Nick Bortolin, former head brewer for Figueroa Mountain, co-founder and former brewmaster for 14 Cannons, who now serves as brewmaster and brand ambassador for Amaretti. Welcome to the podcast, Nick.
Thanks for having us all.
Let's kick things off with kind of a broad question. Michael and Micah, both of you all make a lot of flavored beer. In terms of the amount of beer you make, how important do you find that this world of flavor, fruit, spices, and that kind of part of the brewing world is to the brands? There's certainly this kind of, we've seen this growth in lager. Hoppy beers are all a humongous part of this, but fruit's a pretty big part of what you do, isn't it?
I mean, it's for us, 100%. I mean, it's at this point, it's the majority of what we do, some type of flavoring. Ours is typically kettle soured or imperial stout, but the majority of the work that we produce is kettle soured, so we don't ever release that on its own. It's never a standalone beer, so it's adjuncted somehow with either some kind of fruit, spice, flavorings of some sort.
These are ways of connecting people to beer, right? You have these ideas of flavor. Beer can be intimidating. You look at a beer menu, like, what do I order? But then you see a flavor like, maple, or you see a fruit like passion fruit. And, Micah, all of a sudden people, they have a connection. They know what that means, and they can gravitate for that. You guys play in that space at the brewery.
Yeah, very much so. I would say that we have essentially two classes of beer. We have beer that, as our director would say, a beer flavored beer, and then we have everything else flavored beer. Obviously, there's one of those categories that will never change and will always be in people's hearts, and there's a big variety of beer flavored beer. But then when it gets to that, it doesn't taste like beer. Beer is where you really have to be on point, because, like you said, you can't say that there's anything that has passion fruit if it doesn't taste like passion fruit. If it's there but not present, people will, they'll eat you alive just on aromatics, let alone flavor, if it's not evident, which is sometimes a sad thing in the world, where you could say, like, oh, well, we added this fruit to it and we like the very subtle expression. But I see a lot of people that are going to want, if there's a fruit called out on a label, they want to taste that fruit.
It is a funny thing. I the power of suggestion is so strong on beer labels that, but that becomes a double-edged sword where if you tell someone something is there or that you suggest that they are going to, taste this and they do, then they feel like they, as a taster, are smart and savvy and they've gotten it. But if you tell them it's there and they don't get it, then, if you read the Untapped reviews, like that's the first thing that they're going to mention out there. It said I had this, but I didn't get that in it. And so, yeah, well, but let's talk about creative process for a little bit. And Michael, why don't when you guys are thinking about, bringing a new flavored kettle sour, quick sour beer out there into the market, what does that creative process look like? How do you go about thinking about flavor to bring into some of these new products?
Well, I think one of the challenges is once you go down the path that we have, and I mean, we don't do very many year-round beers. I mean, some beers you'll see in the portfolio year after year, but they're only available for a limited time. You just have to keep the ideas coming. So the process for us is somebody has a great idea, doesn't matter who it is, we're going to test it if it seems like it might be something interesting. And then, it's just like you were saying about some fruits. You put it in there and it's like, well, sure wish you could taste it. It's not always quite that easy, But we found out that what's that sandwich cookie that's black with the white center? You probably I can't say the name, right?
You can say Oreo. You can say Oreo if you want to.
We found out if you want to make an imperial stout with Oreos, just adding a ridiculous amount of Oreos wasn't the way to get there. Because once you add alcohol and all the other flavors that are there, it can get complicated. So, usually what happens is just somebody has an idea and then we test it like that first. Just, I would say as basic as we can. And then in our case, we're usually trying to go a little bit more over the top with the flavor or unusual, which, I think might be easier than taking, a nice delicate approach to it, honestly. But at the same time, this usually happens on a 4-barrel system at the tap room in Oklahoma City. And then once we decide that's what we're going to do, I've got to scale it to a 50-barrel and it never scales.
Sure.
So it's a little bit of starting over. At least you know what the target is. So, it's, how it is too. As you've been doing this for a while, you've got some gut feelings on where it's going to go. And, it's all about that first batch.
Sure. So Mike, as Michael is just saying, sometimes just adding that thing doesn't get you where you need to go. And you need to start thinking about what those flavors are that are components of this thing that you are trying to recreate in the flavor. How do you guys at the brewery go about breaking down what the core components are of something so that you can then rebuild the idea of that flavor from its components?
It's a great question. I think the approach on it sometimes, like Michael said, is, if we're trying to do our favorite sandwich cookie beer, because I'm just going to keep saying that because it's annoying that we're not allowed to say it outside of the podcast and anything else. You kind of want to just throw a bunch of them into it just to, in a pitcher on your desk, just to make sure that it is going to taste right. But then trying to extrapolate that into a larger batch, sometimes honestly adding the real thing to it isn't feasible beyond a small trial. A lot of times what I like to do is I like to research homemade recipes of those things. So if I'm thinking I want to have something that tastes like your favorite sandwich cookie, I'll first start by looking at someone who's got a recipe to make them at home. Because if I want to know how do you extrapolate those flavors, my first thought would just be like, oh, I'm just going to do chocolate and marshmallow with some vanilla. But maybe there's something else that's in there that I'm like, oh, you know what? I could replicate that flavor aspect of it with something that I wouldn't necessarily think is going to be the first ingredient. And so that's kind of where I like to approach things like that, is just what are the basic components? And I think that's where we go. There's often ingredients that are in baked goods that don't necessarily translate to your mind for actual flavors. We use cinnamon a fair amount when we're trying to help bring out some of that pie crust flavor. Even though cinnamon may not be a prominent flavor, it's something that allows your mind to think, this reminds me of pie. And so like a small dose of cinnamon can go a long way. And so little things like that, where it's more than potentially just, vanilla and chocolate, because at a certain point, if you just say it's made with, cacao nibs and vanilla beans, that could be just about anything, and you've got to try to sell it. But you get that extra little flavor, and that extra flavor is what sends it the rest of the way.
Yeah, those kind of almost sub-threshold like impacts of various flavors are kind of fascinating in the way that they impact the perception of some of these. And I've heard a lot of brewers in this space talk about how like just even the tiniest amounts of vanilla will bring some of these fruit flavors forward, where you're not tasting the vanilla, but it's going to make that fruit, come forward. Nick, for you guys at Amaretti, you are building some of these flavors are doing some of this kind of background work to understand what some of those components are going into the things that we perceive, as that favorite sandwich cookie. Talk a little bit about, how the flavor scientists work, in that kind of realm, because I find that kind of flavor chemistry, just to be a little bit fascinating.
One of the coolest things about Amaretti is we're a family-owned company still. So even though some might perceive us as a big brand, we're still kind of a local Southern California family-run company, and all of the flavors here are done by our CEO, Jack. Jack's is responsible for all 4,000 different products in our catalog. So it's always fun, to walk around the office and then taste what he's working on lately, because it's always something new. And kind of to what Michael spoke about earlier is, the customers always want something new. And so we feel that as a flavor house that, we're getting the pressure from brewers too. The top question I always get is what's new, like what's available, and to try and help that taproom demand a little bit. We just wrapped up the CBC show in Philadelphia, and that was the number one question we got from everyone that walked by the booth was what's new. So it is a lot of fun to see the development of the new products here in-house. And then my job is I get to then play with them and test them in beer, pilot it with beer just to make sure that it is going to work and it's going to work when brewers like Micah and Michael go to scale up with the product as well. And it's not always a home run. Obviously, some things just don't translate. But we just spent 4 months coming up with a new pickle juice recipe because it's 2026 and it's the year of the pickle, right? And so it was a lot of fun to watch the journey go from the use of just natural flavors, different pickle brines, different vinegars to land with something that is going to be, a home run, whether you're making a pickle lager or a pickle lemonade with it. And it got a great reception at the show. So that was pretty satisfying to see that flavor that we've been working on for months have such a fun impact at CBC.
I'm writing that down.
Pickle juice craft puree.
Here we go. We do a pickled beer, and hey, they're not the same year to year to year.
They're not.
Welcome
batch
to the world.
You have different brines. Yep.
Well, I'm not trying to hog the conversation here or jump in there, but I mean that's a thing that we deal with all the time. And sometimes you have to deconstruct things a little bit and add something you wouldn't think you would need to make some flavor come alive in it. And luckily for us, we're willing to cheat a little. We're not trying to make it. We want it to taste like we want it to taste. So we're willing to go whatever route that might be, like at this point, I don't even know if anything we've done that I would consider weird anymore. We've used dry cake batter in beer before to get that kind of, that mouthfeel and that the way, some kind of cake-esqueness in a beer, like a sandwich cookie beer, for instance.
I think cheating is the wrong word. I'm not trying to call you out on this one, but I think cheating, maybe not the exact way that we should say it. I think when we live in a world where the top gastronomic chefs are using every weird tool at their disposal to make interesting food and flavor and texture and present that at the highest end of the culinary spectrum, that using the technology that's available to us as brewers is also, it's all fair game, right? You use the tools to create the experience that connects with people. And, as brewers, you want to find there's some honor in finding the absolute hardest way to do anything, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, and, we found out that there are certain things that just, it can't be done, or it can't be done well. There are certain fruits and certain flavors that we have just never been able to get.
What's an example of that, Michael? What's something that you worked on that you just just could not make it actually click?
Banana.
Really?
They've tried everything you can imagine. And the only thing that seems to translate, and again, you're in an alcohol environment, sometimes it's an imperial stout. So you're talking about 12% ABV and you're adding stuff in there, and man, it can get weird. But we've never been able to successfully get banana like you would expect it to be. And that's another thing, expectations management here. We've used bananas. We've put them in, just peeled and put them in. We've cooked them first. We've used all kinds of manner of other things. And this is going to be goofy when I say this, but the only thing I found that tastes like banana in an imperial stout, and we haven't released one like this is just in the testing stuff, is banana Laffy Taffy. Go figure that one. And unfortunately, you can't buy it unwrapped. So that's not going to work. Now, I'm not saying that somebody else hasn't done it, and it just got so crazy that we couldn't get there that we just abandoned it, But it's a tough one. Strawberry's tough too, but not like banana.
Sure. That brings us, to this kind of idea, and maybe Micah, you can speak to this. One of the, the biggest challenges in this kind of, working in this flavor world is having these flavors read as authentic. If something reads as, either like too subtle or, disappears, or on the other side of it, something tastes synthetic or like there's a, sharper alcohol extract edge to it, then, we're in a sophisticated enough beer world where those kinds of things have a hard time really, truly connecting with audiences. So the name of the game is building something that feels seamless, and it has to hit that kind of full spectrum, not just of flavor, but also of aroma, because you want to set, so much of what we perceive as flavor is actually aroma, both going in, but also coming back out through that retronasal. Talk about how you all approach some of these, challenging ingredients from that kind of full spectrum, perspective.
Yeah, it can definitely be a difficult task to extract some of those flavors. I think graham cracker is a great example of, you can put crushed graham crackers into a beer and you can extract the flavor, but the amount that you have to put to sacrifice the absorption of the beer to also risk a lot of other processes, along with just cleanliness and just, the sanity of your cellar team. You could switch to, just a straight extract, but then a small bit of too much graham cracker extract, let's just say from a few years ago, of something that we might have used, it tastes artificial. It tastes sharp. It almost has like a slickness then, like on the mouthfeel, where when you drink it, you're just like, as a consumer, you might say something is just off. Like, it's there, but it's not what I was expecting. And we really don't ever want, we don't ever want a consumer to try a beer and then have to question the flavors of it. So when it comes to things like that, that's where, in the last year or so, there have been a few trials that we've done, because honestly, like doing a lot of dessert type beers and sweeter beers, especially with the barrel aged, we're quite fortunate with being able to use our Black Tuesday as a base for a lot of our blending, having such a high threshold on its alcohol content. It actually takes flavors really well. So we've learned the long way, and I guess the hard way on both sides of overdoing ingredients and underdoing ingredients. But I think when it comes to something like that, what we do is a lot of bench trials on like really small dosings, and then kind of work our way up, with a large panel of our brewers, especially if it's a sensitive ingredient. Like I don't think that you could go over the top on something like blueberry. You know, I think it would be really difficult to have someone drink a beer with blueberry in it and say there's too much blueberry, especially if you're talking in an imperial stout world. Same thing with like maple, like they enhance the sweetness, they enhance the flavor, like they'll get over the top. But then when you start dealing with things like, say, like graham cracker, if that graham cracker becomes artificial in any way, shape, or form, it just tanks the whole thing. And so being able to use, we did in this last year, we used the graham cracker natural artisan from Amaretti, and it's great expression because it's already got that kind of crusty cracker like flavor along with that nice little pop of cinnamon, where it's like it was a great substitute for beyond just a kind of old school ethanol extract versus way too many bags full of crushed graham crackers clogging up a tank. So it's a great benefit being able to have some options out there where we can also start small, but also build pretty easily on those flavors.
Michael, do you think about aroma and flavor, both separately and together? Are you thinking about some of these, modern ingredients in a way that, just target either the nose or the flavor and maybe do so? I mean, everything is interconnected, but they also, are there some times where you are using flavor in multiple formats, say, in order to build that kind of broader spectrum of reality?
Definitely. We think about that a lot, especially when you're, just like Michael was saying, you're talking about an imperial stout. I mean, you got to get over the top, first off, over the top of the imperial stout to begin with. And then if it's a barrel aged one, so now you've got something you're dealing with here that you have to add some aromas and flavors to that have to be above and beyond what was already there. And we found out for us, again, it's different for everybody, but at this point in the game, the imperial stout base and the kettle soured base have been tweaked so that that's what they're for. We don't ever release those as standalone. Those two, brands or whatever, really have been engineered to accept flavors and allow us to put things in there. And, it can get really weird in a hurry sometimes because of the alcohol environment. But just like he was saying with the graham crackers, we've done it where we tried to use a regular product and that didn't work out too good, but we found out that we could use a little bit of maybe an extract and a fruit or whatever, and you kind of get a little something from both. Some guys don't want to do it that way. But for us, I hate it when you read something on the label of the beer and you drink the beer and you're like, well, where's that at?
Sure. I want to come back to that, but also I'm curious when you say you've engineered your base recipes of imperial stout and this kettle sour, what that means, or did you lower bitterness in an imperial stout and in order to allow some of those flavors to come forward? How have you manipulated the base recipe of your kettle sour in order to make it, to tune it in to accepting more of these flavors?
Well, for the imperial stout, it wasn't so much about the bitterness. Maybe so, not the hop bitterness, but depending on what kind of roasted malts you're using, that might be fine if you're just making a standalone imperial stout. But if you're making an imperial stout base that you're never going to sell that way unless you add, let's just talk about bomb. It's got ancho chilies, it's got cocoa nibs, it's got coffee, so you've got all those other elements. And you could take 12 bottles off the line or 24, whatever, when we're packing bomb and drink one every couple of weeks until those were gone that you collected that day. And it's amazing how different that beer is over time. I think if the base beer is too complicated, it's complicated to get the flavors you want out of it. And in the case of the kettle sour, it's a little bit different. We have a baseline acidity that we are trying to hit. And of course, we grow our own lactose, so that's a whole different thing. But it matters, or I think it matters anyway.
Micah, how do you all work with your based recipes? Now, something like Black Tuesday is Black Tuesday is Black Tuesday. And, over time, I imagine it has kind of evolved into, just something where it needs to work as a standalone, but then it also has to work with some of these flavors. Or do you have a slightly different, kind of base recipe that goes into barrels, knowing that certain of these are going to be, side streamed into more flavor forward beers?
Yeah, definitely a little bit of both there. We of course, when it comes to Black Tuesday, it takes any ingredient pretty much with a great expression of its flavor. But it also gets complicated to then say, hey, we try not to muddy the waters too much by basically devaluing, our flagship Imperial Stout by putting fruit in it every month, and kind of then trying to then say at the end of the year, here, now it has no adjuncts and it's the best one. It's like, well, we got to kind of mitigate that. So we'll also do a lot of blending with it, where we'll use it to kind of blend. We actually I guess we blend into it to blend down ABV, because we also need to make beers that are not at 19% and are approachable to some other people out there. But we have a couple of base barrel-aged stouts and beers that we have. We have a Musket, which is our barley wine base, Monster Stout, which is also another Imperial Stout, but it's on the sweeter side. It's a kind of a high final gravity, so we get a nice bout of sweetness there. We had another one that we were running with the past couple years called Bayonet. As Bayonet and Musket, they were kind of a pair of that went into a lot of blending, but and then we have our anniversary base, which is our old ale. So that's kind of like our main set of our blenders. And Monster Stout is one of them that, to my knowledge, we've never released Monster Stout as just Monster Stout. The closest that it's been to a single release is within its Vanilla Villain era, and that's just Monster Stout with up to 14 different types of vanilla, so it's still over the top complicated. It's not anywhere close to it. But this year, earlier, I guess in January, we released Musket, the barley wine. Just here's the bourbon barrel aged barley wine. Huge hit. It was really great to kind of let just a barley wine go out without cinnamon or marshmallows or coconut and a bunch of other stuff in it. So we are building upon that a little bit more this year. But all of our beers outside of let me see if I can say this the right way. So Black Tuesday is designed for the barrel. Black Tuesday is an unacceptable fresh beer. It's our house yeast, which is a diastatic Belgian strain, which means it is loaded with Belgian esters and bitter florals, and it works its way out in the barrel and becomes this beautiful chocolatey, slightly roasty, incredibly boozy stout, just well-rounded and incredibly I don't want to say approachable, because the 19% stout is not really approachable, but it's balanced. Whereas something like Musket, the barley wine fresh off the fermenter, is already beautiful. It's really then just an advancement in the flavor profile, getting it into barrels. So it's kind of nice to have something where if we wanted to, we could pull it fresh and do some fun treatments with it there. And then the same thing with Bayonet. Bayonet was great. We did learn that Monster Stout, we don't really love it as much coming off fresh. It's really something that does a lot better coming out of the barrels, just giving a little bit of time to age. And so those beers kind of stuck us there with, well, if we want this, we need the time and the dedication for it. So we also have a fresh stout base that we just call it our DTC stout, which is just our direct to consumer stout. And it's when we don't want to do barrel aged, we want to do something that can land in their lap without having to be within our memberships or hitting these extremes, but we can still take that stout as a stout that would be really great if we just said, hey, here's a stout, but also something that can take flavors. We did some playing with it, kind of like Michael said, in the one of the iterations that we ran with it. It definitely had too much roasted barley. It was a great stout, but then when we tried to put flavors in it, the roasted just overtook it. And so we've refined that recipe back down to kind of balance out some of the roasted notes from the stout and have a little bit more of a soft, chocolatey, oaty kind of a palate to it, which then allows for those flavors to come through. Because If it's too bitter, it doesn't matter how much maple syrup you put in it, you're still going to get the bitterness and the expressions of that bitterness.
I remember years and years ago talking to one of the brewers then at the brewery. They were recounting to me in confidence that just how challenging it was to make a maple flavored beer, and that no amount of maple syrup was ever going to give you the aroma that you needed to kind of convey that kind of maple character. And so they would lean on extracts in order to push that kind of aroma piece. Are there some other ingredients like that for the two of you where you find that even if you are adding that in as the actual ingredient, to kind of boost a flavor component, that top noting, with with an extract of some sort, helps build out the full idea of that?
Yeah, I would say there's a couple things on our end. Maple for sure. I still second that. It's an incredible flavor, but like you said, kind of at the beginning, a lot of the flavor that we taste comes from the aromatics. And then with maple in a beer, you're getting sweetness and flavor, but you're not necessarily getting the nose on it. And so you have to get that aromatic. So we'll use extract in maple beers to make sure that nose pops. Because if you don't smell the maple, you're not going to taste it the same. One of the things that I would say for sure is kind of just in the varying level of fruit. There's some fruits out there that you could smell it from across the room, and there's no question that you would ever have to question what that fruit is. Like passion fruit is a great one. I don't think that you'd smell passion fruit and not know what it is. Guava, you know what guava is. It's there. But then when you start dealing with other fruit that maybe are a little more subtle that people don't just have on the regular basis, or it's something that they have in recognition with something else, like mango. Mangoes are incredible. They're great. They taste wonderful. But if you said, what does a mango smell like? Somebody might be like, I don't know that I could identify it, or you might put a mango in front of them and they might name 10 other fruits that are all in the tropical realm. So I think that that's something that when you call out a fruit like that, having extracts and something to boost aromatics with like mango is definitely something that's there. And this is going to sound really silly, but I'll still say it anyhow, is coconut and pineapple. Both of those flavors. And I think it's just because a lot of people will smell coconut and think pina colada, and then they will smell pineapple and they'll think pina colada. And they kind of translate both individual fruits into one other combination of the two. So I think that coconut doesn't need help. I don't think so. But a lot of people will still smell coconut and they'll think either Malibu rum, or they'll think pina colada, and they'll think these other products that exist beyond it. And so I think being able to make sure that the nose is very specific to those, and pineapple more than I'd say coconut, because it's a lot of people will smell pineapple and then they'll think about coconut, which I think is an odd scenario, but I also think that it really exists.
Well, no, I mean, that's the way the brain works, right? You have these associative kind of, things, and the experience of those are so close to each other that they get connected, even on this kind of, subconscious way where it's hard to pull it apart. No, and you're right. Like riding that line with coconut and pineapple to where, and I see it even within our blind reviewers. If, you get to the dreaded suntan lotion point, then, it's game over there, but if you can stay in that kind of daiquiri zone, then it's beautiful and expressive and everybody loves it. And, it becomes a really fine line. Nick, for you, working with these ingredients, are there some other, kinds of key, flavor verticals where you find, both using the thing and, finding ways to top note becomes crucial in getting like a very realistic and compelling expression of that flavor?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the projects we did with actually Micah was we made a peach milkshake IPA. And with that, we, Amaretti has so many different product lines. We were able to actually layer it with different peach products from Amaretti. And I think the end result was fantastic. So we took one of our concentrates, our artisan line, and we fermented with that. So we actually fermented with a peach fruit concentrate. And then, Micah, you were in the brewery when it was fermenting and texting me and just telling me, how much peach notes you were getting from the tank. But then, as we all know, like the earlier you add any kind of aromatic, it's going to flash off during fermentation. But it still gave like an incredible like peach base to the beer. And then we followed that up and we did hit it with, some peach craft puree. And then the combination that I thought was a lot of fun to really drive this hazy home and to help the mouthfeel of the hazy and also just make the peaches pop was we used our marshmallow extract. And using marshmallow extract, I think is, a secret weapon for a lot of our customers. And it's just so fun how versatile it is. Anytime you have like a vanilla, you mentioned earlier, substituting maybe that vanilla and all that work you're doing with vanilla beans for just a couple ounces of a marshmallow extract is a lot of fun to see how that enhances the fruit and really makes, everything more well-rounded and softer. So I think going back to what you guys were talking about earlier with, recipe design, really just being conscious of not only the types of fruit and flavor you're going to add, but also when you're going to add them, the timing in the recipe, I think is really important and should be considered when you're writing that recipe. Are you going to just flavor at the bright using just a top note? Is this going pre or post filter or centrifuge? That's really important to consider in your recipe. And there's different fruit products for that to use. Is it going to go into primary fermentation? Is it going to go into secondary? And then like something that is, definitely worth talking about, and I think we'll talk about it a little later today, is that product going to be pasteurized? And how is the type of fruit and the timing of the fruit affected by that process?
Michael, why don't you talk about fruit here, a little bit? I love this idea of using concentrate, which is basically, just juice, but a very, strong juice type product versus puree, which is also, fruit flesh in with that. And then, how do you then think about using fruit in these forms within, a kettle soured beer, and then potentially also popping, later on, with something that's, there for the aromatic push?
Well, it really depends on what it is you're trying to do. I mean, it always goes back to that because when you think about cherry, right, it seems like a pretty straightforward, you've had a lot of cherry beers, everybody loves it in a beer, but what do we think about that versus what the consumer thinks? Because unfortunately, in my opinion, I found that a lot of people's reference point for cherry is like maraschino cherries. And I mean, if that's what you're trying to do, then that's great. But then you do a cherry beer and you use, some wonderful aseptically packed or some fresh whatever. And they're like, yeah, that tastes like cherry. It's like, well, yeah, it does. So you got that, right? And you somebody, I guess, so Nick said the scary word there a minute ago, pasteurization. So the way we handle flavoring has changed quite a bit in the last couple of years, because before let's just say we got the kettle sour base in a tank, and look, I don't ever know what those are going to be 100% on the hot side. I mean, we're brewing the kettle sour base, we're brewing the imperial stout base. It could be so many different brands downstream. It's the same base on the hot side, and it kind of has to be that way for practical reasons for us. But then it would be in the fermenter. We might add fruit, this, that, and the other thing, or some kinds of sugars. We had to let that ferment, right? Because you don't want that fermenting in the cans or the kegs in 38 states, right? That's a whole nother thing. But what we found out is some things, fruit fermentations can be different. It's not like, and look, we've done some mixed culture stuff back in the old days. We had some fooders for a while, and that's awesome too. But when you ferment fruit in that environment, it's different than using a kettle soured base and 05 is the yeast. Because some fruits produce what I like to call the BO character. And that's not very pleasant. You know what I mean? So how will we do that right now? We'll ferment it out. We'll add the fruit to it, centrifuge it, pasteurize it.
Well, how does that fruit addition look? Or at what point does that happen? Walk us through, how you add it, when you add it, and are there any special considerations in how you do that?
Yeah, we're going to add it at terminal gravity. More often than not, we're going to crash the tank, add the fruit. There is a kind of a sweet spot there as far as how long you've let it sit on the fruit before you centrifuge it, but that's how we do it now. And
what is that sweet spot?
Well, I'm going to say for us, it's going to have to be at least, it's going to need to be at least a couple of days, 72 hours, but that's something we've played around with quite a bit because,
And you're talking about then using puree or concentrate at this point?
Well, typically for us, the fruit's all aseptically packed fruit, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to add, something else at the bright tank, an extract that's the same as the fruit that we added as well, because you're kind of trying to play both sides of it there. And something like an extract we won't add before we centrifuge. Because, we also found out that some of these things have a lot of the densities are different of these products, and you add them all in there. Hey, I'm not a scientist, right? I'm just a brewer. And, these things will stratify in the bright tank if you add a bunch of stuff in there and it's not agitated before it gets packed. Because that really sucks when you find that out. It's like, whoa, the cans on the front of the run are different from the cans on the end of the run. What went wrong? And a lot of times it seems a lot more obvious once you figure it out, but some things just don't work as well as you would like them to until you really have more experience with them. Does that make sense?
Sure. Mike, how do you homogenize and make sure that you can avoid this kind of, stratification issue? Are you guys, constantly recircling? Do you use higher concentration maceration into liquid that you then blend back into a tank, and measure as you go? Over the years, I've heard lots of different methods that brewers use in order to, get these kinds of things dialed. How, what's that process like for you all?
It definitely varies, kind of like Michael said, by the product and the end goal. Like it's across the board, if we were talking about like a fruit fermented, either let's just say hoppy or like lighter beer, like those are all just a fermented fruit. And if they are, they're getting a top note of extract, which we don't really have to worry about like a small dosing of extract. I would say stratifying, but that would happen in the bright after it's centrifuged. Basically right before packaging. And a lot of that just comes down to like the planning for a beer like that, because there's no way we're going to run a hazy IPA with tropical fruit in it and then add the fruit late and have to pasteurize it. Like we're not about to cook hops, but that's why kind of like what Nick was saying, where we were able to add some of those extracts, like the marshmallow, we were able to make essentially a lactose free milkshake IPA that had that quality without having to worry about allergens, but we also didn't have to worry about late addition fruit into something that couldn't survive without pasteurization. When it gets to some of our bigger stuff with like the barrel aged beers, obviously we're not throwing fruit into the barrels, and letting them sit in the barrel. We're going to treat that beer with the fruit when it comes out of the barrel. And so we'll recirculate those beers kind of depending on what they are, what the fruit is, whether it's a solid fruit, I guess, like coconut. If we're actually using like shredded coconut, we're just going to put that in bags and recirculate it until the flavor's there. Typically with coconut, we won't see like the flavor drop. But then when we start dealing with more of the purees or concentrates, those we'll try to keep them on like an active recirc until they're ready to get centrifuged. Just in that pre-process of the centrifuge, we'll try to keep them active, make sure that the fruit stays kind of layered evenly. And then we'll try to run it so that we get an even result across the board. We have seen over the years a few beers that specifically either had so much fruit in them that we weren't able to actually separate, or a few other things that have had some powdered ingredients. Like we've done a few beers that had cacao powder in it, trying to get that like real good like flavor pop. But then the way we're able to centrifuge if we still had little particles left over. Didn't realize it until, we got to the bottle. But then with those late edition fruits, we'll typically try to make sure that we separate out anything that's out of the layer of densities, so that it'll stay nice and even. We do have some beers that we'll do, especially more like on the pilot side, that we'll produce that are they're not filtered, they're not centrifuged. They have actual fruit blended into them, and the tasting room team loves when I write on the keg "shake well." So we try to avoid that for their sake at all possibles. But on the large scale, we'll typically keep those beers moving until we're ready to actually separate out the particulate.
Nick, what kind of role does temperature play in this conditioning process with concentrate or pureed fruit? And, what do you find either in your own brewing or, in those of the folks that you're working with, how temperature can affect different kinds of ingredients in this conditioning process?
Yeah, we see that a lot with non-beer beverages. People will be making a seltzer, for example, and their experience dosing a seltzer is going to be much different than dosing a beer, even though they're using the same product. They're going to have a harder time when something's cold crashed to 32 degrees to get it to mix properly, or not happy with seeing settlage, which is, I have a lot of experience in, my 15-year career of brewing in the past of doing this. So, the same thing. I was worried about putting 800 pounds of an aseptic puree in a tank, and then all of a sudden your yield is just destroyed. It's really hard to package, can be hard to carbonate. And so making the switch to an Amaretti product that is actually engineered to blend into beer without the headaches really saved my back. And that's how, I became, I had such a good relationship with Amaretti back when I was a brewer. I was just seeing, I've decreased the amount of labor, and the final product of the beer is better, and I'm getting like a higher yield. And it was, what actually broke me was when a customer, said, "Hey, this batch is a lot better than the last batch. Would you do differently?" And that kind of opened my eyes. So for us, it is, all of our products are engineered to be cold side additions. I think that's really important when we're talking about temperature. But I find it best to treat a lot of our fruits as like a dry hop. So you're lowering your tank, you're getting harvesting and getting as much yeast out before you make your fruit addition. And then that does still allow for like a secondary fermentation to happen, because I know that not all of us are, the size of Michael or Micah, and not everyone has a pasteurizer in their brewery. So we, allowing for that secondary fermentation to process the sugars in the fruit is the best case scenario for using a lot of our fruit products. But then, if you want to avoid the whole thing and not have to worry about mixing anything or blending, then we certainly have the solutions to just dose a bright tank with, an extract or a natural flavor.
Michael, with your kettle soured beer, how do you think about the interaction of acidity and pH or total acidity and, say, a fruit flavor in there? Making sure that those things align. How do they interact for you all? Do you have a very consistent acidity that you then, work to for these beers, or does that change based on what the fruit is to kind of align with people's perception of acidity and that fruit flavor? How do you then use acidity to help kind of support this idea of the fruit itself?
Well, that's a really good question. And 10 years ago, my answer would have been completely different than it is now. But for us, it's important. We make so many kettle soured beers, right? And the thing is, for us, is we've got to maintain a baseline acidity so that no matter what brand it ends up being, it's something predictable. So predictable when you're using a natural process to produce lactic acid. Yeah, how are you going to do that, right? Well, first off, you got to be able to test for it, which is not hard. I mean, I don't know if I can do it, but we have a lab guy, right? And man, where would we be without him? And you forget about him until he saves the day, right? But that's a huge deal. So we're tracking that. So for us, I mean, on a slow week, we're gonna mash and sparge 4 batches of kettle soured wort on a Monday, inoculate it, start boiling it Tuesday morning. So we're going to do 200 barrels. So that's going to get tracked. And if it's going to be X beer, it's going to be fine for that one. Maybe it's not great for this one. We add a little sugar. We back sweeten it before we pasteurize it. It really depends on what beer it is, but you wouldn't be able to do that if you were just hoping that the acidity was going to be where you want it to be. And look, obviously we did it that way. And once we started tracking the total acidity and how radically different it could be from week to week to week, it's like, well, hey, I don't like that. How do we fix that? So we ended up fixing it, and I'm going to try to make this, I'm going to try to condense this down a little bit because not everybody wants to hear about all this. But so we figured it out the same way that, 10 years ago, somebody was like, there's no way you can do lacto fermentation overnight. It's like, I have to. I can't tie up the kettle sour. I can't tie the kettle up like we used to. Put it in on Friday, check in on Saturday, check in on Sunday. Hope the hell you didn't have to boil it till Monday. But I can't do that now. So by growing your own lacto, you can afford to pitch enough to make that happen overnight. And by controlling that, you can also get a lot more consistent with the amount of acid that you're producing. So that's how we do it. We grow the lacto ourselves, and it's a 5-day deal. Is it too complicated? Probably. I like it. I'm the one that does it. Gets me away from other stuff so I can think. But when you're pitching 7 barrels of lacto starter on 200 barrels of wort, it gets pretty busy. It'll do it. That's the trick to me. You can buy lacto from the lab. You can buy dry lacto. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with it. It's great products. It's just expensive if we were trying to use it. And I think it's another one of those things that you can't put your finger on it, but there's other stuff that happens, like a bottle conditioned beer, right? Something magic happens. You can't put your finger on it. But whenever we use because we've done a lot of co-packing for other brands over the years. And, one brewery that we did some stuff for, it's like, well, you guys grow your own lacto. How about if we buy lacto for ours so it'll be different? I was like, yeah, okay. Man, it was way different. It was sour, but you don't get the carryover kind of aspects of that you do if you grow the lacto yourself. And here's the secret. It's not really that hard to do.
That's true. If you're a brewer, you know how to do this. And yeah, I loved it. I remember at New Belgium years ago, they had a lacto reactor, and, they would just do the same thing. They'd just be growing their own lacto. And, you can keep that culture going and add it where you need it. Let's talk.
That's exactly how we got into it.
Yeah.
So we wanted to brew a Goza, and we convinced the boss that we needed to go to Leipzig to research it, right? So we go to Bayerischer Bahnhof, and that's what they're doing. And the brewer there was like, you're not going to take notes? I'm like, hey, I didn't want to offend you. Yes, I'm going to take notes. Now that's okay. And I was really surprised at how they did it. So, of course, we wanted to do it. That was the cool way, right? We've dialed it in a lot more. About a year ago, we spent about a year and a half going through the whole process from growing the initial starters to stepping that up and pitching it, and the temperatures, and whatever you read, it may be correct in a textbook. It wasn't correct for us down here in Southeast Oklahoma. You got to find the stuff that do what you want it to do. So there's no real right or wrong, right? It's just, this is what works for us, and it's going to be different for somebody else.
We're in some real Nietzsche territory here, beyond good and evil. And, no, there's things that work. And, if you are honest and transparent about it, and, but also if you care about your customers, you're going to give them something that they enjoyed, drinking. You're not ever going to give them anything that's not safe for them, and you don't want to sell them something that's going to fall apart before they open that up and drink it. So all of these pieces are important, right? It's not just that I made it this way. It's also that when they choose to open that it's going to give them the experience that you've promised them. And that it kind of brings us to this kind of flavor stabilization topic. We've talked about pasteurization as being, and you guys both pasteurize because, there are some, in order to kind of create some of that stability. But, let's talk about this kind of like, long-term like flavor that lasts, and then how you, kind of maintain that in these. Are there some specific like, troublesome flavors and ingredients that you've found that, don't hold up long enough, that you need to bolster in certain ways in order to kind of make them last in a package? How about you, Micah? You guys have to have had some experience with that.
Well, there's two specific ingredients that stand out as something that we're going to want to check the life of. Let's just say that is coffee first and foremost. Every brewer out there that's probably put coffee in a beer at some point has had an issue with just the way that coffee is going to integrate, it's going to age, and how it's going to eventually age out. Let's just say your beer. I have had some coffee beers from people that are like, wow, this is older than I thought it would still be really good. I've had some from us that lasted longer. We've had some that fell short way sooner than we would expect. But I think with coffee, there's a certain aspect of it, especially when it comes to like how to treat, how to use, how to, when you're adding it. But the other one that I think was more surprising for me as like a pre as a consumer than getting into beer was coconut. We've seen coconut fall off in beers at times sooner than we would have expected, because especially being such a identifiable and like kind of aromatically pungent ingredient, especially with like at high dosing rates. That was one that I was a little surprised that we had some coconut beers that didn't necessarily like, it didn't taste bad, but then tasting them and kind of just feel like, oh, this kind of tastes more like a beer than it does coconut. And just having it kind of age out a little bit of the kind of flavor and mellow down to where it's not as strong. That was one of those surprising to me. So coconut for sure is probably at the top of my list.
Michael, how about you guys? Are there, some flavors that you have to work harder at in order to make them last in a package? And how do you go about solving some of those flavor and aroma challenges?
Yes, there are. I think one of the things that is beneficial about doing a lot of adjuncts in a kettle soured base is the low pH seems to help things last longer in the package, at least in my experience. I don't know why, but that seems to be a huge thing. And then
it's the pickle effect, right?
It's something. But the other thing too is, at least for us, was how we extract, depending on what it is, what adjunct we're using, the actual way that we extracted the flavors and aromas from it to begin with. So, none of this, we didn't plan to do. This was just something that kind of, we did something unusual and people liked it. And then it's like, how weird can we get? So, but back in the old days, we would literally pile all this stuff in a fermenter and then rack the beer on top of it, right? And you would be tasting this, every day, seeing what the flavor and aroma was like. And once you got where you wanted to, then it's like we got to fight the liquid loose from the adjuncts in the tank, right? And you hope you get what you get. And, you get 10, 12% loss on a very expensive beer, and that's a problem. So the question was, how can we fix that? You guys might know Ashton Lewis, you might know Ashton.
Ashton's been on the podcast a few times, for sure.
So I've known Ashton since like the 90s, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm an old guy. I'm 57. Anyway, so Ashton worked for Mueller forever, right? So just one of those kind of things that at the CBC, we're having a beer, talking shop, and he casually, I'm probably complaining about something like this, right? where our yield was bad, having trouble getting the flavor aroma transfer. And he was like, we've been working on this thing. It's really made for dry hopping, but it might work for you. It's like, what's that? The Max Loop. For whatever reason, maybe they were trying to get guys to buy into this is a new way to do it. You could get one from them and use it for 30 days. And I'm like, yeah, put me on that list. So the difference between this and some of the other kind of apparatuses that are like that is it's an ASME rated tank. So you're pushing through it. You're not putting stuff in there and then trying to use the pump suction to pull through the screens, right? So we've never clogged one. So we used this thing for 30 days and bought one, and a year later bought another one. So we have to have it. But that's a huge thing, something that would take us 5-6 days before, and then you got to try to fight the liquid out of the tank and off the adjuncts. We load this thing up with whatever manner of thing you can imagine, connect it to the tank and recirculate it for 24 hours, maybe 48, and it's time to go. And then you can, once you get the liquid out, you can let it sit there for a little bit and then push the rest out with CO2. I mean, it's, so you're looking like 3-4% loss. That's a huge thing. And then,
so all the ingredients stay isolated then in this vessel?
Yeah. So it's got a V-wire screen down the center of it. And we've got different ones. We don't really ever change them out. We just use the finest one that we have, and that seems to work for everything that we're doing. But here's the deal. I'm making this too long. But what we found out was by the constant recirculation through those adjuncts, whatever it is you're getting off of them is what you want, because it has the aroma and flavor transfer is better and faster and seems to have more staying power. Again, I'm not a food scientist, but there's other things that are going on in there, right? And that's a huge deal. And the benefit also is you get more yield. So Ashton's not a mueller anymore, of course, but occasionally those guys will give my email address to somebody and somebody will email me, hey, have you ever used so-and-so in there? It's like, yeah, that works fine. No problem. But it's a huge deal. And we use it for everything you can imagine, not just coconut, and coffee beans. That's easy. But let's say you want to dissolve 1,250 pounds of Sour Patch Kids candy in 50 barrels of beer. Load it up. Start recirculating it.
How much head pressure is on that as it's going through this process?
Man, I wish I could tell you that. I probably should know that, but
it is under pressure.
Yeah. Well, while it's what's in the vessel is certainly under pressure. And these are things that we had no experience with until we tried this stuff, like starting a pump on the Max Loop and leaving for the day. Let it run all night, right? You worried about it the whole time until after you did it once. Pasteurization was the same way. I mean, pasteurization is a dirty word in craft beer. Well, maybe beer in general. But I had no experience with pasteurization until we had one. So, and the first one we had was a flash pasteurizer. And that was such a game changer. And then we were lucky enough to get a grant and get a tunnel pasteurizer. And then when you have both, we used for different things, and you can compare pasteurized, non-pasteurized for yourself and for other people in some kind of triangle test, that's when everything that I thought I knew about pasteurization I knew nothing. And I'm going to say it. It's going to be controversial. You ready? Heavily adjuncted beers for us that we do are better pasteurized than not pasteurized, because the way I see it, I've got a food service background. It's just like when you're watching your favorite cooking channel on YouTube and you see the chef who takes some spices, heats them, in his saucepan before he does anything else, to wake them up or whatever kind of adjective he's using. I think you get the same effect with a heavily adjuncted beer and you pasteurize it. Now, I will say this, that doesn't mean to just uncontrollably pasteurize it. If a little's good, a lot's better. Yeah, it didn't work like that. But we've got a sensor they load into a can of beer and they run it through the pasteurizer of the product you're going to pasteurize, and you can calculate the PUs a lot more effectively by doing that. So you don't want to heat it any more than you have to, right? But I don't know. I like it.
It's exactly what you would call a hot take, right?
I think so. But I mean, if you would have asked me that, 4 or 5 years ago, I would have said, there's no way. There's absolutely no way. And it's hard to convince people of that. And so I tell them the same thing. Just come try it. You don't have to believe me. And it might not work for what you're doing. But, no trickery involved here. We're not going to substitute the samples. But, we do it, every once in a while on something just to make sure that we think it's what we think it is, right? Because it's not hard. It's the cans go through the pasteurizer no matter what. So you don't have to turn it on. I mean, we do. Even if it's something that it's not getting pasteurized, we don't actually pasteurize everything yet. Working on that. But we want them coming out of the pasteurizer at room temp so that we can 6-pack them and stretch wrap them and load them on a truck. Right? Because wet cans on a truck in Oklahoma, not a good thing.
Micah, for you guys at the brewery, how does that how do you think about that pasteurization and stabilization step with some of these ingredients? And, as Michael has just said, are there some where you find that pasteurization step actually improves that overall flavor? Especially when you're talking about expensive beer, like you can't just count on 19% alcohol to keep everything safe in there. There was a time where we thought we could, and then Goose Island, of course, found out the hard way that, the nature is a tough one and finds a way, even in these kinds of environments, that we think it can't. So, the last thing you want to do is sell somebody a $40 or $50 or $60 bottle of beer and then have to refund it when the microbial world inside of that proves to be more complex than you thought. Talk about your process for and how you, are there, what you generally do, and then are there some exceptions where you dial things in different ways because some of those ingredients need to be treated differently?
Yeah, we have a couple standards. The first one is actually just the alcohol threshold. So we have a certain percent alcohol in the tank that if it's going to be below that range, we just automatically, if it's coming out of barrels, we say pasteurize it. You don't even question it. It's between that range. We're not going to risk it.
Before it even goes into any next process, you are pre-pasteurizing before maybe even adding ingredients.
Oh, no. I just mean like we just have it on paper to know that this product will get pasteurized.
Yeah. Okay.
Because there's a handful, like say, obviously Black Tuesday coming out of the barrels, we're looking at 19%. That I guess I should start there. Like if we were taking a Black Tuesday and adding like vanilla beans, adding some maple syrup, adding some blueberry, within moderate quantities, we don't need to pasteurize it. It's high enough alcohol. Most of the time we don't even worry about it. Now, if we start getting into some of those Black Tuesdays where there's an absurd amount of fruit, that the fruit is actually then diluting the alcohol down to a closer in within our threshold, then we'll pasteurize it to be safe. But a lot of those don't need it. But then when it comes to pretty much everything else in our barrel stock, we're all living then just like the rest of the world within that 12 to 16, 17% alcohol range. That adding fruit to those means that if we say we're going to take our muscat, our barley wine, our bourbon barrel aged barley wine base, and add any ingredient to it, we're going to plan on pasteurizing that just kind of right up front. And so that's a good standpoint. Then when we get to some of our other beers, we'll look at what we need and what we don't. I think a great example of something like that is our horchata. So it's a blonde ale with vanilla and cinnamon. Cinnamon gets added in the fermenter. And for years and years, we pasteurized it, even though the cinnamon went in towards end of fermentation, crash tank, centrifuge off of it. We pasteurized it because it was what we did out of safety. A few years ago, we ran a batch of it where we're like, our lab team was like, we're not getting hits on it. Let's just not pasteurize it. And we didn't. And it was fine. The beer survived. There's no problem. The flavor fell sort of flat on that batch that we didn't run. And it's because we had spent years with a specific dosing rate of cinnamon and vanilla into this beer, knowing exactly what the pasteurizer was going to do to the flavor. But until we got to that point, didn't realize how crucial that pasteurization step was. Like, it still tasted great, but the cinnamon was a little bit shy. And so therefore it was kind of like, oh, it's the kind of inverse effect of like, hey, what did you guys do different with this one? Where you're like, oh, I don't want to hear that. Because it saved the process, when we're talking about, 90 BBL running through a pasteurizer, and you're like, oh, well, that's a 16-hour day for a 2-shift crew. Ooh, we better plan for that, And so it's kind of planning those type of things, tried to make production a little easier. And that batch kind of verified. They were like, nope, we're still going to pasteurize it because we like the flavor and what it does to the product in the long run.
So then describe to me this process that you use. Is this pasteurization happening after, potentially top noting or adding extracts in that bright? Is it happening? Are you pasteurizing first and then adding, aseptic flavoring? Explain that, or does that change based on what it is and, that specific ingredient that you're adding?
Yeah, I would say a lot of it depends on the ingredient that we're adding and where we're adding it. When it comes to extracts, a lot of times we will add extracts post centrifuge. And that's just because that's going to give us a more true volume. And so that way we can dose more appropriately, especially if we're talking about something that might have, like Michael was saying, if something has a 10% loss, well, then we just way overdosed that extract, and if it's something that has a 3% loss, maybe we underdosed it. And so we might have to touch it again. So at the earliest we would do with an extract is post centrifuge, but oftentimes with the extracts, simply because of what they are, we're able to add them post pasteurization. But for our sake, a lot of times we'll still add them after the centrifuge. And that's simply so that we will centrifuge, add extracts, and then we'll pasteurize. And that's just so that we don't have to try to touch that finished product in its final bright tank with a recirc. Adding a recirc adds in another element of potential like cleanliness. If we risk a pump having a small air leak, we risk anything that's not really worth it in that scenario. So a lot of times we'll do it before. We have done top notes on extract post pasteurization, and a lot of times it's because we get to it, we're like, oh, it needs a little bit more. So we know that we can safely do that, but a lot of times we'll still plan, especially because our pasteurizer has a pretty reliable loss to it, that we can kind of predict how much we're losing there. The centrifuge is sometimes a little bit more wild, just not knowing what we're pulling, how sludgy it's going to be, or especially if it's coming out of a fermenter, kind of going off of the original reading of a flow meter from, 30 days prior, you're kind of hoping that the volumes are correct. So we do that. But when it comes to like purees or concentrates, every one of those guys is pretty much going to go in pre-centrifuge. And that's just to make sure that it can. We have done in the past where we've added some concentrates, natural artisans and things post-centrifuge, but it's also because we know that they're going to incorporate, and that we're not going to really worry about like particulate settling on those. A lot of times we'll add them before, but when it comes to, I would say a lot of the products that we've done from Amaretti using natural artisan, like the natural artisan concentrates or like the extracts, we'll add those post centrifuge. And that's again for just more for appropriate dosing volumes, so that we can use the product accordingly. Cause I'm typically running a bench trial and setting up those dosing rates based off of, a trial at my desk where I'm typically either eyedropping or, stirring with a spoon off of like a little gram scale, so I got to make sure that I'm keeping the dosing relevant to the actual product too.
Sure. Well, we've been talking for a while now, Nick. I'm sure we haven't covered everything that we intended to cover going into this, but are there any other, kinds of best practices for ingredient addition that we absolutely need to get in here, before we bring this to a close?
I always just like to remind brewers to make sure you're including the adjunct in your recipe when you're writing the recipe, and realizing some things like, a nice firm bitterness on your West Coast IPA. If when you add citrus to it, it's going to be harsh and unpleasant, right? So the more we think about the ingredients as a whole and adding adjuncts into your base recipe and altering that base beer, not just taking your core beer and flavoring it, but altering the recipe of that core beer so it can be flavored, the more success you're going to have using adjuncts.
And then, of course, if the exact thing that you're looking for is not in this exhaustive catalog of things that are available to you, you guys even will develop, custom things specifically for customers. Michael, you guys went through a custom development project, right? To get a flavor that you really wanted to have for a beer that you just there wasn't a stock one.
Yeah. And I don't know, it took us a while to remember that was available from Amaretti, if you want to know the truth. You know how it is. The pace at a brewery is not like the standard pace of life. You're a lot of times you're in a hurry, you're either hot and wet or cold and wet, it's the same thing. You don't think about these things that seem, what? Well, why did we never think of that? So anyway, during COVID, the tap room in Oklahoma City, which I don't know if you know the geography of where I'm at, but our tap room in Oklahoma City is 2 hours from us. And during COVID, they had to close down. We were only having people at the brewery when there was work to be done. So we were going to pay people for 40 hours a week and ride it out or go bankrupt or whatever. But we were trying to take care of our people, safety and financially and whatever. Well, I didn't have anything else. I didn't know what else to do. I went to work anyway. Right? So one of the brewers comes in the door one day. So as soon as Oklahoma City could sell beer to go again, they didn't have enough beer. So I was making one barrel of this, that, and the other thing and shipping it to them. One of the brewers walks in one day. He's got a bag of Skittles in his hands. It was just like that. And I was like, okay. So we did it and sent it to Oklahoma City and they sold it. It was like instant. I was like, okay, cool. We got to figure this one out. Well, we worked on this forever because there's a lot of sugar in Skittles. We didn't have a pasteurizer at the time. And then the more we scaled it up, the harder it got because there's a lot of stuff. The coating on Skittles and this and that and the other thing is there's sludge in the tank and you don't want that in cans. Apparently people don't like that. So anyway, once we're ready to go, we can't get Skittles, right? And I can tell you, the people at Mars Wrigley were awesome. But I can tell you what, they're not really that interested in selling thousands of pounds of Skittles to a brewery in southeast Oklahoma. So then it's like, well, what the hell are we going to do now? So I guess we're not going to do it. And I don't think it was me, but somebody on the team was like, doesn't Amaretti do custom stuff? And I was like, that's right. And look, I'm not saying this because I can see Nick right here and he works at Amaretti. Okay. This is how it happened. We fired off an email. Couple emails back and forth. There was a phone call. They sent us the first shot. We were happy right there. That was it. It's not like we nitpicked it back and forth, 12 iterations of this flavoring. We were like, that's it. We need it. Send it. So, I wish that we would have figured out how many Amaretti products we've used over the years. And I'm not even sure how we got turned on to Amaretti in the first place. I actually tried to figure that out before the podcast. Nobody can seem to remember how we got turned on to Amaretti years ago. We've used a ton of stuff. And again, I'm not saying this because I'm on the podcast here and Amaretti and whatever. I don't know what we'd be doing, And I don't know how many times occasionally we still get a print catalog. People still send catalogs out and that's fine. I'm old. I like to touch it. Lands on my desk. I start flipping through it and I'm like, hey, Amaretti's got XYZ. We should try that. That's a thing.
Michael, I'm very appreciative of the S-type flavor that we now have in our catalog. Thanks to you guys. So
yeah. And actually, and this is, again, this is one of those things that you find out the hard way sometimes. We think that the beer is better with the extract than it was when we were using candy. It's most certainly easier and the yield is better. We also feel like the flavor is better. And, when we were talking about pasteurization and safety a while ago, the way we got into pasteurization wasn't necessarily because we were trying to make it shelf stable. I mean, from we were, but that was from a bacterial standpoint, because you buy candy, cookies, blah, 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 blah. You're expecting that the FDA has signed off that this is safe for human consumption, right? You'd be surprised how many things have a lot of lactobacillus on them. And you add enough of them, like we would be inclined to do, and then you don't have the ability to pasteurize, and it's like, wow, sour imperial stout, not that great, right? After you mess it up, it's like, wow, we shouldn't have done that. But also, it's that you weren't expecting there to be large quantities of lactobacillus on a sandwich cookie. But you got to think about that, unless, that's what you're after.
Well, I think it's hard to top Michael's deep praise for Amaretti, so maybe we just wrap it up there. Nick, if people want to learn more about the products that Amaretti offers to brewers across each of the ranges that you all offer, where can they learn more about Amaretti? What should their next steps be?
Amaretti.com. We're a one-stop shop. My email will be in the show notes as well. I'm happy to talk process and custom flavors with anyone that wants to reach out.
Well, awesome. I want to thank Amaretti for partnering with us on this special episode. Learn more about that incredible range of products, not just for brewers, but for everyone in food and beverage at Amaretti.com. If you're a brewer making flavor-forward beer today, you have the best ingredients, tools, and process knowledge at your fingertips. You even got folks like Nick here who will talk you through your process and help you solve that problem. And Amaretti is there to partner with you on your beers to make your beverages successful. Go to the website, check out their products, give them a shout, get the conversation going. We will be back on Friday with a new episode of the podcast, but thank you, Michael. Thank you, Micah. Thank you, Nick. It's been great talking with all of you all about adding flavor to beer. Cheers.
Cheers, boys.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I'm a fan of the show. It was an honor to be a part of it. Thank you.
Same here, very much so.
Awesome. Thank you all. Have a great weekend. Cheers. This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those who love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.